Welcome. We are taking a look at a case that is, just a truly complex and heartbreaking piece of criminal history. It's a case that has defined decades of investigation in Finland.
It really has. Our goal today is to work through the sources you provided, which detail the Lake Bodom murders. We want to conduct a really thorough analysis.
Right. We need to understand the facts, of course, but also the spectacular failures of the investigation and why, even after all this time, this crime still resists any kind of definitive resolution.
It's an essential exercise, really. It helps us understand how a single, brutal event can capture the attention of an entire nation, defy being solved for decades, and ultimately, reveal these critical fault lines within a criminal justice investigation.
The core facts seem simple on the surface, but the context around them is anything but.
Exactly.
So we're focusing on one of modern Finland's most enduring and frankly disturbing unsolved crimes. The basics are brutal and clear. This tragedy happened in Espoo, Finland, on Sunday, June 5, 1960.
And the human cost, you just can't overstate it. 3 teenagers, Mela Ermeli Björklund and Anja Mäki, both just 15 years old.
So young.
And Seppo Boisman, who was 18. They were all brutally killed while they were camping.
And there was a sole survivor, Nils Gustafsson, also 18, who was very seriously injured. It's a case just marked by this immense loss and a complexity that investigators are, well, still grappling with today.
The randomness of it, the sheer audacity of the attack, it just shocked a nation that was really accustomed to quiet and safety.
So why does this case, more than 6 decades later, still resonate so profoundly in modern Finnish history? Beyond just the fact that it was a triple homicide.
I think it's primarily because the failure to solve it immediately became a kind of national scar. It was this shocking interruption of innocence in a Katoyat recreational setting.
A place people go to feel safe.
Exactly. And the investigation failures that followed became a central, unavoidable theme. It stretched the case across decades. And it demanded these repeat examinations by law enforcement, by the judiciary. It really teaches a fundamental lesson about policing.
So our approach has to be comprehensive. We have to look at the attack, the critical early missteps that corrupted the evidence,
The numerous suspects who emerged in that vacuum of proof, and then, of course, the incredibly dramatic trial that took place 44 years after the crime itself.
Okay, let's get into it by setting the scene for what happened near Oya Manor. We should focus first on the victims and the location itself.
Sounds good.
So it begins with a plan for a simple, fun camping trip. On Saturday, June 4th, 1960, these 4 teenagers.
Right, 2 couples. The 2 15-year-old girls, Mela Björklund and Anja Mäki, and their 18-year-old boyfriends, Seppo Boisman and Nils Gustafsson.
And they decided to go camping along the shore of Lake Bodom. They set up their tent near Oya Manor, just looking forward to a normal summer weekend.
It was meant to be a weekend excursion, nothing more. The shift from this peaceful setting to a horrific crime scene happened very early the next morning, on Sunday, June 5th.
And the timeline is critical here. It's estimated to be sometime between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. Eastern European time.
That window is so crucial because it was still dark enough for the killer to operate mostly unseen, but it was also getting light enough that, early risers like nearby bird watchers were already active.
And the method of the attack was swift, shocking, and ultimately fatal for 3 of them. All 3 who died, Mäki, Björklund, and Boisman, were killed by a combination of stabbing and severe blunt force trauma to the head.
And they were attacked while they were sleeping inside their tent.
Which is just terrifying.
And what's structurally important about this crime is that the sources confirm the assailant attacked the occupants from outside the tent.
Through the canvas itself.
Yes. They used a knife
Yep.
and some kind of unidentified blunt instrument, it could have been a rock or some other heavy object, by striking and stabbing right through the sides of the canvas.
Just think about the geometry of that attack. It means the victims were largely defenseless. They couldn't see their attacker clearly.
And the killer didn't even necessarily have to enter the confined space of the tent to inflict those fatal injuries.
That dynamic suggests a very sudden, brutal assault on a sleeping, enclosed group. It minimizes the risk to the attacker. Which brings us to the discovery and the very few witness sightings we have from that chaotic morning.
Around the estimated time of the attack, close to 6 a.m., there was a sighting that would later become a really contentious but vital part of the official record.
The bird watchers.
Exactly. A group of boys who were birdwatching nearby reported seeing the tent collapse, and more importantly, they said they observed a blond man walking away from the site.
This early testimony, even though it was from a distance and maybe compromised by the morning light, it established that initial narrative of an external attacker.
It did, but the actual discovery of the victims didn't happen until much later that morning. It was around 11 a.m.
Right, by a carpenter named Esko Oiva Johansson, who then immediately alerted the police. And the police arrived on the scene around noon.
And this is precisely where the tragic narrative of the murders meets the catastrophe of the initial investigation. The consequences of what happened next resonated for decades, and, you could argue, prevented justice from ever being truly achieved.
This is where the source material gets just so frustrating for anyone trying to analyze a cold case. The speed and the severity of the critical errors made by law enforcement, I mean, right when they arrived, it's stunning.
It is. They arrived around noon, but completely failed to cordon off the site or record the scene details properly.
It's a textbook example of how not to preserve a crime scene. It really reflects the, let's say, the primitive state of forensic investigation standards back in 1960.
Absolutely. Instead of isolating the area almost instantly, a massive crowd was allowed to contaminate the site. And this wasn't just curious onlookers.
No, it included numerous police officers and other people who were just permitted to trample all over the place, disturbing any potential evidence.
We're talking about critical physical evidence. Things like footprints, traces of blood spatter outside the tent, maybe fibers, the precise arrangement of objects that could reveal the killer's actions.
All of that was compromised, instantly and irrevocably.
When you think about the consequences, the long-term cost is just immense. If there were clean footprints leading away from the scene, maybe identifying the killer's shoe type or their gait, they were certainly destroyed.
Any subtle microscopic evidence on the ground around the tent just trampled underfoot.
And the mistake was made even worse by a lack of coordination. Instead of having forensic experts carefully search the land, the police called in soldiers to help search the lake area for missing items.
Their intention was probably good, to recover crucial evidence, but their movements just caused further massive disturbance to the area.
The inability to secure that location adequately is universally cited as the single biggest reason this case remained unsolved for so long. The entire foundation of the physical investigation was, well, it was rotten from the very start.
If you connect this to the bigger picture, it just demonstrates a failure of institutional training, right? In 1960, the concept of crime scene integrity, the whole CSI effect we take for granted today, it just wasn't standardized, and it clearly wasn't implemented effectively in this part of Finland.
And once that scene is corrupted, every single piece of evidence found after that becomes questionable. It complicated not only the initial hunt, but also the sophisticated DNA analysis that happened decades later.
You can't uncontaminate a scene.
That is the tragic truth. And beyond the physical contamination, the killer left behind this confusing trail of missing and left behind items, which just added another layer of ambiguity.
So what exactly was taken, and what was found nearby that was so puzzling to investigators?
What the killer took was perplexing. They took the keys to the victims' motorcycles.
But the motorcycles themselves were left completely untouched at the site.
Exactly. It suggests an intention, maybe, to cause some kind of logistical confusion, or maybe just to keep a bizarre minor trophy that held significance only to the killer.
But the most significant item found nearby related directly to the survivor, Nils Gustafsson.
His shoes.
His shoes.
Yes. Gustafsson's shoes and some of his clothing were found partially hidden about 500 meters from the murder site.
So the killer took the time and effort to walk 500 meters, conceal the shoes, and then presumably return, leaving Gustafsson barefoot at the scene.
It raises a really important question. Why go to the effort of hiding the shoes 500 meters away, but leave the big, obvious motorcycles right there?
Was the killer trying to suggest they arrived on foot? Or maybe trying to disguise the survivor's condition? Or was it just about eliminating a piece of evidence that could track their retreat?
That ambiguity is critical, and it fueled endless speculation. It also suggests a degree of calculation, despite the immediate violence.
And perhaps most damaging for the whole initial investigation?
The murder weapons themselves, the knife and the blunt instrument, they were never located.
So without the weapons, without a clean crime scene or a clear motive, investigators were immediately just chasing ghosts in an already chaotic landscape.
Which brings us to the sole survivor, Nils Gustafsson, and the intense brutality involved in the attack.
He was found outside the tent with fractured facial bones and multiple stab wounds. He was clearly a victim himself, suffering a severe injury profile.
He was a victim who survived, but the sources really emphasized the disproportionate nature of the attack on his girlfriend, Mila Ermeli Björklund. This stands out even among the incredible violence directed at the other two teenagers.
She was found undressed from the waist down, and she suffered the most extensive injuries of all the victims. And crucially, the sources detail that she was stabbed multiple times after her death.
That specific detail, the postmortem stabbing, is forensically very significant. It's not characteristic of a simple, quick robbery or some spontaneous outburst of violence that then just stops once the threat is neutralized.
It indicates something else entirely.
It indicates extreme, sustained, and targeted violence toward her specifically. It distinguishes the brutality shown to her compared to the other two teenagers who were slain with less excessive force. This strongly suggests a highly personal motive directed either at Mela herself or perhaps at the relationship between her and Gustafsson. It implies an intense psychological rage.
So that moves the crime away from, say, a random mugging or a generalized anti-camper attack, and it focuses attention inward. It suggests a killer who knew, or was perhaps obsessed with, at least one of the victims.
Exactly. The level of rage shown toward Mela really speaks volumes about the killer's psychological state and their possible connection to the group.
Meanwhile, Gustafsson himself, despite his severe trauma, he managed to recall a fleeting glimpse of the attacker. He described someone clothed in black with bright red eyes.
A truly terrifying detail.
Yeah.
But you have to ask, given the trauma, the early morning light, and the severe blunt force injury he had sustained to his head, how reliable could that red eyes testimony have ever been?
It sounds like a detail born of shock, or maybe even hallucination.
And that's the enduring challenge of trauma testimony. It might be a distorted memory of, say, a car's headlights, or perhaps it's a psychological projection of absolute terror. Either way, that description, combined with the forensic evidence of extreme focused violence on Mela, has fueled speculation for decades.
It confirms that the attacker was likely motivated by something far more profound than just petty theft.
Right. And this inherent confusion, compounded by the initial investigative errors that allowed all those crucial clues to just vanish, it meant that for years, the police and the public were left just grasping at theories and speculating about a handful of outsiders.
So, against this backdrop of chaos and lost clues, the investigators were forced to pivot their focus entirely to the few human leads they had.
So let's look at the suspects who filled that vacuum.
The vacuum created by that initial failure allowed speculation to just flourish. And over the years, 3 individuals became the most notable figures identified by the public and by investigators, leading to years and years of agonizing uncertainty.
It's important to remember that without concrete, verifiable evidence from the scene, because, well, it was destroyed, these theories often relied on local gossip, questionable confessions, or, compelling but largely circumstantial timelines.
These individuals were often suspects more by public consensus than by hard legal proof.
Exactly.
Okay. Let's start with suspect A, Valdemar Gillstrom, the hostile kiosk keeper. He seems to fit the profile of the antagonistic local almost perfectly.
Gillstrom was immediately under suspicion in the local community. He was a kiosk keeper from Ojeda, so he was in the general area, and he was known for being openly hostile toward campers.
The sources paint a picture of a clearly violent man. Locals knew he would cut down tents, throw rocks at people who dared to camp too close to his property.
He certainly had a visceral, clear motive to dislike the presence of these teenagers in his area. So a local antagonist who resented the intrusion of campers, known for aggressive behavior.
But if the community was so certain, why did the police officially dismiss him?
Well, this is where we see that classic tension between local knowledge and police procedure. The police found no hard evidence, no murder weapon, no blood, no fibers, to link him definitively to the murders.
And they were skeptical of the alleged confessions he was rumored to have made.
They were. They considered him disturbed and potentially unreliable.
Yeah.
The police need physical evidence. Local sentiment, even if it's highly suspicious, just isn't enough for a murder charge.
It seems like a missed opportunity, though, to fully follow up on that local fear and gossip. But the sources suggest the theory involving Gillstrom didn't just fade away.
That's right. It was resurrected in a major way decades later. The sources mention a 2006 book that brought this theory up again in detail, and it cited previously unheard local testimony.
And what did it claim?
The theory detailed in the book argued that Gillstrom was, in fact, the man seen returning from the murder scene by locals, the same blonde man the birdwatchers might have seen.
And the explanation for why this wasn't reported immediately back in 1960?
The book suggests that the neighbors were simply too terrified of Gillstrom's known violent temperament to report him directly to the police at the time. Essentially, the local silence was rooted in fear.
It also claimed there were language barriers between some witnesses and investigators.
Yes, and other operational issues that caused the police to immediately ignore A lot of evidence that was previously unknown or just dismissed by the public.
It really suggests a profound system failure on multiple levels, fear paralyzing the community, and a potential failure by investigators to follow up rigorously on crucial local information.
And Gilstrom's end in 1969, when he drowned in Lake Bodom, most likely by suicide, it closed that specific avenue of investigation permanently. It left the question of his guilt forever ambiguous.
Okay, let's move on to suspect B. Hans Assmann, the German citizen. This theory is perhaps the most sensational, thanks to popular books written about him, and it centers on deeply compelling circumstantial evidence.
It really does. Assmann was a German-born, naturalized Finnish citizen, and his location is immediately compelling. He lived only a few kilometers from the shore of Lake Bodom.
So he was physically close to the crime.
Very close. And what's fascinating here is the circumstantial evidence tied to his behavior the day after the murders. On the morning of June 6, 1960, Assmann showed up at a hospital in Helsinki with bloody clothes, clearly agitated and behaving erratically.
That is a massive red flag. Under modern protocols, that person would be detained immediately for questioning, but the police seemingly dismissed him.
Yes, the police did not take the suspicions seriously, primarily because Assmann reportedly had an ironclad alibi for the night of the Bodom murders.
And here's where the pattern becomes intriguing. The source notes he also allegedly had a similar alibi during another murder he was later linked to, claiming he was in Germany at the time.
It suggests a pattern of having these strong, location-based alibis that protect a suspect with otherwise highly questionable circumstances. It's the hallmark of someone who is potentially very adept at covering their tracks.
It sounds like investigators were dealing with a complex individual, possibly someone who managed to manipulate timelines or witnesses. What else makes him stand out in the sources, beyond the bloody clothes?
Assmann was, unfortunately, a person of interest in multiple serious cases. He was a suspect in 5 other cases, suggesting a history of involvement in criminal or violent activity. He even confessed to one case on his deathbed.
And he later moved away.
He did. He moved to Sweden, where he died in the late 1990s. The sources indicate that a series of popular books heavily pushed the theory of Assmann committing the Bodom killings, citing the convenience of his alibis and his general violent history. That's what really cemented his notoriety in the public imagination, even if the police officially cleared him early on.
So we have a man with proximity, a physical appearance at a hospital linking him to violence the next day, a history of suspicion in multiple cases, but officially cleared due to an alibi. It encourages you to think critically about what constitutes a reliable alibi, especially in a time when tracking movements was far less precise than it is now.
It does. And finally, we have suspect C. Pentti-Soininen. This is a very different type of lead, reliant entirely on a confession.
This theory emerged during the mid-1960s. Soininen was known for violent tendencies, and while he was incarcerated, he claimed responsibility to a fellow inmate.
As you noted, confessions, especially those made in prison, you always have to view them with some inherent skepticism, but they carry enough weight to warrant an investigation.
But the primary reason for ultimately questioning his involvement hinges on a stark physical reality.
His age.
His age at the time of the crime. The sources point out that Soininen was only approximately 14 years old at the time of the murders.
This single fact raises immense doubts about his physical ability to single-handedly overpower 4 older teenagers, 3 18-year-olds and 1 15-year-old, in a violent, chaotic struggle.
I mean, we have to consider the immense physical challenge. The victims sustained extreme blunt force trauma, multiple stab wounds. Could a 14-year-old, likely physically smaller and less developed than the 18-year-old boys, inflict that level of sustained violence?
Including breaking Gustafson's jaw and then managing the subsequent cleanup and escape. While it's not strictly impossible, it certainly makes his prison confession highly questionable as a statement of fact.
It could have been a boast or just a claim made to gain status within the prison environment.
Very likely. So we have a youth confession, a hostile local who likely died by suicide, and a suspicious German citizen with convenient alibis. For decades, these were the potential answers the public turned to, all pointing towards some unidentified outsider.
But the case took a massive, unexpected turn 4 decades later, focusing the spotlight squarely on the sole survivor.
The legal landscape shifted dramatically in late March 2004. That's almost 44 years after the events. Nils Gustafsson, the sole survivor, was arrested and charged with the 3 murders.
It's unbelievable.
Yep.
And this arrest was based entirely on new forensic analysis. It marked the beginning of a modern judicial attempt to resolve this cold case that had haunted the nation for so long.
The Finnish National Bureau of Investigation was confident enough in the new evidence to declare the case solved in early 2005. That is a massive claim after 4 decades of failure.
And it required forensic technology that didn't even exist in 1960. What was the basis for this confidence? What allowed them to re-examine the physical evidence?
The entire case relied on advancements in DNA technology. In 1960, blood evidence could only be analyzed using basic ABO blood, determining type A, B, O, or AB.
Very limited.
Very. By the 2000s, investigators could use sophisticated analysis to develop full DNA profiles, even from extremely degraded or minute samples collected 4 decades earlier. This allowed them to re-examine existing evidence, particularly bloodstains on clothing and those hidden shoes, with a precision that was just unimaginable in 1960.
So, using this modern science on the old physical evidence, the prosecution's case fundamentally changed. The central argument was that the evidence pointed to an attack by Gustafsson, not just on him.
Exactly. The prosecution's theory was intricate, and it required a radical reinterpretation of the crime scene. Their narrative was that Gustafsson had been drunk, which led to an altercation, possibly because he was excluded from the tent by the others.
And this altercation began, potentially with his friend Seppo Boisman, where Gustafsson's jaw was broken.
Right. And this fight then escalated catastrophically into him committing 3 murders.
The physical evidence supporting this, the thing that gave them the confidence to declare the case solved, was tied directly back to those hidden items, Gustafsson's shoes.
That is the critical piece of evidence. It had always been known that the hidden shoes, the ones the killer took and concealed, belonged to Gustafsson, who was found barefoot. The modern DNA analysis confirmed unequivocally that the blood of the 3 murdered victims was present on those shoes.
So the key piece of evidence that the killer had hidden carried the blood of the victims and belonged to the survivor. That certainly seems to point a direct line toward him, but the prosecution had to logically explain why Gustafsson was also so severely injured.
They explained it by focusing intensely on the absence of evidence. The prosecution argued that the critical distinction was the lack of Gustafsson's own blood on the shoes.
Okay, what was their logic there?
Their logic was that if his injuries had occurred at the same time, during the melee of the triple murder, a struggle where victims' blood splattered the shoes, then his own significant fresh injuries should have left his blood on those shoes as well. Since his blood was missing, his injuries, they argued, must have occurred at a different time or under different circumstances.
Wait, so the prosecution is claiming he committed 3 murders, which resulted in 3 different victims' blood on his shoes. Then he had the mental acuity and cold-bloodedness to hide his own shoes 500 meters away, and then self-inflict severe injuries to create the illusion of being a victim.
Yes.
That requires an almost superhuman level of staging immediately following a catastrophic loss of control.
That is precisely the complexity of their argument, and it relied on accepting this radical scenario. Their interpretation was that the only logical explanation for the forensic data victim's blood present, his blood absent, was that Gustafsson committed the murders while wearing the shoes.
Then, after the murders, he faked the theft by hiding the shoes, maybe wiped them down to make sure his blood wasn't on them, severely injured himself to account for his broken jaw and stab wounds, and then returned barefoot to the tent site to pretend to be unconscious.
It was an extraordinarily high bar to clear.
It seems like a massive leap. You're asking the court to believe the killer, immediately after a frenzy of violence, cooled down enough to orchestrate a complex, 500-meter-long ruse involving self-mutilation.
It was. And to bolster this complex scenario, the prosecution tried to bring in older, less reliable evidence, those decades-old allegations. They alleged that the 2 birdwatchers, upon re-examination, identified Gustafsson as the blond man seen walking away.
After 44 years.
After 44 years. They also brought up claims that Gustafsson had made an incriminating remark years later, and that he had boasted of his guilt to a woman a decade after the crime. These allegations were secondary, but they served to try and paint a portrait of his guilty man who had been concealing his crime for decades.
So we have a forensic theory based on the absence of blood, coupled with a narrative of self-harm and staging, supported by shaky, decades-old witness allegations. What was the defense's powerful counterpoint to this complicated narrative?
The defense's case was much simpler, and it was grounded in the physical reality of the trauma sustained by Gustafsson. His lawyer maintained the murders were the work of an outsider or outsiders.
And their key argument was his injuries.
Yes. The key argument was that given the severity and extent of Gustafsson's own injuries, the fractured facial bones, the stab wounds, the loss of consciousness, he would have been physically incapable of killing 3 people and staging the scene 500 meters away immediately afterward.
So the defense argument hinges on a simple truth. If he was physically broken, how could he possibly have performed such a violent, elaborate cleanup and self-mutilation? It seems almost medically impossible.
That was their strength. The severity of the injuries sustained by Gustafsson was a key element that contradicted the idea of him being the calm, calculating attacker who then successfully cleaned up, hid evidence, and faked his condition. The defense just emphasized the sheer impossibility of the logistics and physical resilience required by the prosecution's theory.
So after all this analysis, decades after the fact, the court finally delivered its verdict. They were essentially ruling on the credibility of the modern forensic reinterpretation versus the physical evidence of the survivor's trauma.
And on October 7, 2005, Gustafsson was acquitted of all charges. The court explicitly detailed its reasoning, which provides essential context for the final failure of the case. It really demonstrates how a court weighs evidence that is both very new and very, very old.
What were the specific factors the court cited? These are crucial as they determine the official legal standing of the case.
First, the court stated that the prosecution's evidence was inconclusive. In a legal sense, this means the forensic interpretation that the absence of Gustafsson's blood proved he was the killer who staged the scene was not strong enough to meet the high burden of proof required for a murder conviction.
So the evidence didn't eliminate the reasonable possibility of an external attacker.
Exactly. The court viewed the staging theory as too speculative, despite the sophisticated DNA analysis.
What was the second point?
Second, the court cited the failure to show Gustafsson had a motive appropriate for a crime of such extreme seriousness. This speaks to the sheer level of violence shown, particularly towards Milla Björklund. The prosecution couldn't convincingly explain the why.
Why a drunken argument would escalate not just to murder, but to a sustained, frenzied post-mortem attack on his girlfriend.
Correct. The motive presented, a drunken fight, just seemed completely disproportionate to the outcome, which was an extreme personalized triple homicide.
And the final factor, it ties back directly to the time elapsed and the chaos of 1960. It brings us full circle to the initial failure of the police.
Indeed. The court found that certainty about the facts was impossible, given the significant time that had elapsed. This acknowledges that the combination of severe contamination in 1960 and the 4 decades that followed made any modern reconstruction inherently flawed and speculative, even with advanced DNA techniques. The original errors rendered absolute legal certainty unattainable.
And the sources note that following the acquittal, Gustafsson was compensated by the state of Finland for the incredible mental toll of the arrest and trial.
He received 44,900 dawo for the mental suffering caused by the long remand time he spent incarcerated while awaiting trial. This compensation serves as an official acknowledgement by the state that the prosecution, despite their certainty, put a man through enormous hardship based on a theory that ultimately could not withstand legal scrutiny.
A deeply ambiguous, painful conclusion to a long-running saga. The man who was the victim and then the primary suspect was found innocent, leaving the case exactly where it started, unsolved.
Exactly.
When we look back at the entire sweep of the Lake Bodom case, from the moment the bodies were found in 1960 right up through that 2005 acquittal, it's the convergence of several elements that makes the mystery so enduring and so challenging.
We have these compounding factors. You have the initial police errors that compromise the scene, destroying the foundational evidence. You have the confusing nature of the missing items, keys taken, shoes hidden 500 meters away, which suggested calculated action.
And the deep ambiguity of the later DNA evidence, which rested on interpreting the absence of blood rather than direct positive identification of an outsider.
The narrative of the case is really defined by what was missing. The missing murder weapons, the missing clean crime scene, and ultimately, the missing definitive proof to convict anyone, whether it was an outsider or the survivor.
And the lack of certainty surrounding those early suspects only added to the public unease. We reviewed Valdemar Gillstrom, the hostile local whom the police dismissed.
Hans Assmann, with the bloody clothes and those questionable alibis.
And Pentti Sweninen, the young confessor whose age made his claim physically doubtful. In each case, due to a lack of hard evidence, certainty was just elusive.
And the lasting impact extends beyond criminal history and the courtroom. This event remains a powerful cultural touchstone in Finland. It's a symbol of a kind of national trauma.
It has inspired creative works, including the 2016 film Lake Bodom, and perhaps most famously, the Finnish melodic death metal band Children of Bodom took its name directly from the lake and the tragedy that occurred there.
The failure to solve the case permeated the national psyche deeply enough to be memorialized in art and culture. So what does this all mean for you, the listener, trying to understand the lessons of the Bodom case?
It's an investigation that spanned 3 generations. It relied first on primitive 1960s policing, then on decades of rumor, and finally on advanced 21st century forensic science. And the results remain the same.
The lesson here is perhaps one of the most sobering in criminal justice. The absolute criticality of the first few hours of an investigation. When those initial steps fail, when the scene is contaminated and evidence is lost, even the most advanced modern science struggles to provide a definitive, prosecutable answer decades later.
The foundational integrity of the evidence, secured immediately and meticulously, that's what determines the potential for a successful resolution.
Without that, the justice system is just forced into speculation.
A compelling and tragic conclusion. The chance for justice was lost before the search for the killer had even truly begun.
It raises an important question for you to consider, long after all the investigations and trials have ended. The person responsible for the Bodom tragedy may have been one of the named suspects we discussed today, or perhaps the true killer was never within the scope of these extensive investigations at all. Perhaps they vanished completely, never to be identified, all because of the chaos of that first Sunday morning in 1960.
A mystery that lingers, defined by what we didn't know then and what we still can't confirm now. Thanks for listening.